The hands hit her shoulders harder than they needed to, and the sound of her body knocking against the marble pillar rang out across the lobby of the Ashford Grand like a dropped tray of glasses, and for a second the whole room stopped. The pianist's fingers lifting off the keys, the bellhop frozen mid-step, a child by the fountain turning to look. Naomi Sutton did not cry out. She did not stumble into theatrics or grab at the man's wrist or look around for someone to defend her. She simply set her feet, straightened her glasses with two fingers, and looked back at the security guard with the particular calm of a woman who had been handled before and had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can give people in a moment like this is a reaction. Nobody in that lobby knew who she was. Nobody had bothered to ask. They saw a black woman in a damp gray hoodie and worn canvas sneakers, dragging a single battered duffel across imported stone, and they had decided everything about her in the time it takes to pour a glass of water. They were wrong. And by the time the sun came up over the harbor the next morning, the company that owned this hotel would begin bleeding money. Not slowly, not over a quarter, but in one long, public, irreversible day. It had started, the way these things usually do, with weather and bad luck. A line of storms had pushed up the coast that evening and shut down half the regional flights, and 300 travelers had spilled out of the terminal into a city with no rooms left. Naomi had been coming back from 4 quiet days in a rented cabin, 2 hours inland, no staff, no driver, no phone calls she didn't choose to answer. She traveled like that on purpose. Not in a lull. She had figured out years ago that you never learn the truth about a company from the version of itself it shows to people it's trying to impress. You learn it from how it treats the person it has decided doesn't matter. So, she wore the hoodie. She kept the cheap glasses she'd had since before any of it. She carried her own bag, and when her flight evaporated off the departures board, she did what anyone would do. She pulled up the app for a hotel chain she happened to know better than almost anyone alive and booked the last available room at its flagship property on the water, the Ashford Grand. She didn't mention her name. She never did. The lobby was the kind of beautiful that is engineered to make ordinary people feel like they've wandered somewhere they're not allowed. 40-foot ceilings, a fountain shaped like cupped hands, gold light pooling off brass fixtures, the smell of lilies and money. Naomi crossed it slowly, leaving wet footprints on the marble, her hood still up against the cold she'd carried in from the street. And she got into the line for the front desk, behind a couple in matching linen and a man in a camel-colored coat who smelled of bourbon and was telling the woman beside him a story that required him to laugh at his own jokes. The woman behind the desk wore a name tag that read Vanessa, and under it, in smaller letters, Guest Experience Manager. She was polished in the way certain people learn to be polished. A warmth that lived entirely on the surface, a smile she could turn on and off like a light switch. She greeted the linen couple by tilting her whole body toward them. She told the man in the camel coat that of course they'd send up another bottle, no charge, an apology for the wait. And then she looked at Naomi, and the smile went somewhere else, and what was left was the face of a woman who has already decided how a conversation is going to end before it begins. "Can I help you?" Vanessa said, in a voice that meant the opposite. Naomi held out her phone with the confirmation open on the screen. A booked room, paid in full, a king suite on the 11th floor. Vanessa looked at it the way you'd look at a coupon someone had clipped out of a magazine. She did not take the phone. "We're fully committed tonight," she said. "I'm not sure how you got that, but I don't have anything available." "It's confirmed," Naomi said quietly. "The charge already cleared. You can see it right there." "I see a screenshot," Vanessa said. The man in the camel coat snorted into his drink and didn't bother to hide it. "I'd need to verify that, and even if it's legitimate, we sometimes have to relocate guests when there's been an error in the system. We have partner properties out by the airport that might be more." She paused and let her eyes travel down the hoodie, the duffel, the wet sneakers, before she found the word suitable. Naomi did not move. "I'd like the room I booked," she said. "The one I paid for. 1104. Something flickered across Vanessa's face, The small, ugly flash of a person who is not used to being made to repeat herself by someone she's already filed away as beneath her. She leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice so it carried only as far as the desk. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you not to make a scene in my lobby. This is a private property. This is a If you can't be accommodated, you'll need to leave, and I'd really hate to have to call someone to walk you out. You won't have to call anyone, Naomi said. I'm not making a scene. I'm asking for my room. And that was when Vanessa lifted two fingers toward the far wall. The way a woman calls a waiter, and the guard, who had been standing by the brass doors, crossed the lobby in 6 long strides and put his hands on Naomi Sutton without a single word, and the room rang like glass, and everyone stopped. The guard's name was Briggs, and he was not a cruel man so much as an obedient one, which in certain situations turns out to be the same thing. He took the duffel off her shoulder and dropped it, and the zipper gave, and a tangle of ordinary things spilled out across the marble. A paperback with a cracked spine, a phone charger, a half-eaten granola bar, a small framed photograph of an older woman in a laundry uniform. Naomi looked at the photograph on the floor for one long beat. Then she crouched, and she gathered her things slowly, deliberately, and she put the photo back in the bag last, face up, and she stood. The man in the camel coat said, to no one and to everyone, that some people just don't understand where they belong, and a few people near the fountain laughed the soft, embarrassed laugh of people who don't agree but don't disagree out loud either, which is its own kind of agreement. The linen couple studied the ceiling. The pianist started playing again. Naomi looked at Vanessa one last time, and she did not raise her voice, and what she said was almost gentle. You just made a very expensive mistake, she said. You don't know it yet, but you will. Then she walked out through the brass doors and into the rain, and she did not look back. What none of them knew, what Vanessa Pruitt would have laughed at if you'd told her, what the man in the camel coat would have refused to believe, even with proof in his hand, was who they had just thrown out into the storm. Naomi Sutton had not always been the woman that magazines smooth inevitable way, as though her success had been waiting for her at the end of a clearly marked road. She'd grown up 40 minutes north of where she now stood soaking wet, in a neighborhood where the word future was mostly used as a threat. Her mother had pressed and folded other people's clothes at a commercial laundry for 26 years, coming home with her hands cracked and smelling of bleach, and her father had been a name on a few documents and not much else. She'd gone to schools that ran out of textbooks by Thanksgiving. She'd been the kind of kid that one teacher quietly believed in and 3 others quietly resented, and she had learned early to tell the difference and to use both. She'd clawed her way into a state engineering program on a scholarship that revoked itself if your grades slipped 1/2 of one letter, in a department that had not graduated a single black woman in 8 years. She graduated. She walked into an industry that had no particular use for someone who looked like her, and instead of asking it to make room, she'd decided the surest way to be let in was to quietly buy the building. Her company, Meridian Systems, 4 people and 3 air mattresses behind the monitors that first winter, had built a piece of data infrastructure that nobody wanted right up until the moment everybody did. By the 5th year, they were profitable. By the 9th, she'd taken it public and turned up, briefly and without comment, on a list of self-made billionaires in a financial magazine she'd been too busy to read. She didn't throw a party. She moved into a slightly larger apartment and kept the same car for 3 more years, because she'd grown up surrounded by people who performed wealth they didn't have, and she found it exhausting, and she had no intention of becoming one. What she did instead was disappear into the quiet end of money, strategic stakes, silent equity, ownership that left no fingerprints. She held pieces of companies that had no idea her fund existed. And one of those companies was the Vandermeer Collection, the hospitality group whose name was etched in brass above the doors she'd just been thrown out of. Naomi Sutton owned just under 14% of it through a holding vehicle that appeared on no press release and no investor page. For 7 months, she'd been in quiet talks with the Vandermeer board, preparing to anchor a rescue financing package of $290 million. Money the company badly needed to survive a debt wall it was about to hit. The agreements were drawn. The signatures were scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. She had not planned to spend tonight inside one of their hotels. She had not planned any of this, but she had learned, somewhere along the way, that the gap between what a company says it values and what it actually does when it thinks no one important is watching tells you everything you will ever need to know about whether it deserves your money. And she was always watching. She stood under the hotel's awning for a moment, rain sheeting off the gutters, and she pulled her phone out of the front pocket of the hoodie. She opened the thread with her lead counsel, a careful man named Adrian Voss, and she typed 3 words. He would understand them. He'd been bracing for some version of them since the deal began. Then, she called a car, and she got in the back, and in the warm dark of the back seat she made 2 calls. The first was to Adrian, confirming what the message already said. The second was to her assistant, a steady woman named Greta, who answered on the first ring at 11:30 the way she always did. "Pull us out of the Vandermeer deal," Naomi said. "All of it. I want a formal withdrawal of the offer on their desk by 3 a.m. standard language. No explanation." Greta did not ask why, she never did. "Done," she said, and hung up. And somewhere across the city a machine began to turn. Back inside the Ashford Grand, the lobby had already smoothed itself over, the way water closes over a stone. But not everyone had moved on. At the far end of the front desk, half hidden behind a column of welcome brochures, a 23-year-old night associate named Tessa Aguilar stood with a stack of key cards in her hand and a sick feeling spreading out from the center of her chest. She had been with the company for 9 months. She was still on probation. She had spent those 9 months learning to defer to Vanessa, who'd been there 11 years and carried herself like she'd built the place with her own hands. But Tessa had seen the woman in the hoodie's face when the guard dropped her bag, and there had been something in it. Not fear, not even anger, but a kind of terrible stillness, the stillness of someone making a decision, and it had snagged on the edge of Tessa's memory like a hook. She had seen that face before. Not in person, somewhere printed, somewhere on a screen. The kind of face that comes attached to a headline. She waited until Vanessa drifted off toward the bar to soothe the man in the camel coat, and then she did something she absolutely was not supposed to do. She pulled up the property's reservation system, and she searched the confirmation number she'd glimpsed on the woman's phone, and there it was. A real booking, paid in full 11:04, flagged in a way Tessa had only seen twice before in 9 months. A small gold marker beside the reservation, a VIP tier hold, the kind the system attached automatically when a booking traced back to certain accounts. She clicked it, a name loaded, and Tessa Aguilar went very, very cold. She read it once. She looked up across the lobby at the brass doors the woman had walked out of. She read it again. The name on the reservation was tied, through a chain of ownership, the system half helpfully laid out in pale gray text, to a holding company. And that holding company was a name Tessa had read in a business class she'd taken at community college 18 months earlier, in a case study about quiet investors. She opened a browser on her phone, under the desk, hands not quite steady, and she searched the woman's name, and the results loaded slow over the hotel's overworked Wi-Fi. And what came back made her set the phone face down on the counter and press both palms flat against it, as if to keep it from floating away. The woman in the hoodie, the woman they had just shoved into a marble pillar and dumped onto the floor and laughed at and walked out into the rain. Tessa found Vanessa at the end of the bar and told her, quietly, what she'd found, her voice barely holding its shape. Vanessa looked at her, the way an adult looks at a child who said something charmingly stupid. "Honey," she said, swirling the complimentary drink she'd poured herself. "Billionaires don't show up to my lobby looking like they slept under a bridge. Whatever you think you saw, let it go. And don't go digging around in reservations that aren't yours to dig in. That's a good way to lose a job you're still on probation for." Tessa nodded. She walked back to the desk. She sat very still for a while. And then she did the thing she'd just been told not to do. She wrote it all down: the time, the booking, the confirmation, what the guard had done, what the manager had said, and she pulled the lobby camera log, and she wrote out a clear, careful incident report. And at 12:40 in the morning, she emailed it to the regional director of operations, the head of human resources, and the executive office of the chief executive himself. She attached the reservation record. She attached the ownership trace. She timestamped everything. Then she sat there with her hands in her lap, the way a person sits after they've done something they can't take back, and she breathed. The first email landed in the inbox of Harrison Vandermeer, chief executive of the Vandermeer Collection, at 12:41. He was asleep, and his phone lit and dimmed on the nightstand without waking him. The second email, the one from Adrian Voss's firm, formal, brief, unmistakable, arrived at 3. That one he'd set an alert for, because the financing was supposed to close at 9, and a deal like that earns a man's vigilance. He sat up in the dark and read it once. Then he turned on the lamp and read it again, and then a third time, because the words refused to mean what they obviously meant. Naomi Sutton, through her investment vehicle, was withdrawing from the proposed transaction. Effective immediately. No further comment at this time. He sat in the lamplight a long while. Then, with a feeling he couldn't yet name, he scrolled back through his inbox to the email he'd slept through, the one marked urgent, and he opened Tessa Aguilar's incident report, and he read every word, and he looked at the camera log, and he understood, with the slow cold vertigo of a man feeling the floor give way beneath a house he thought was solid, exactly what had happened in his own lobby that night. By 5:30, he'd been on the phone for an hour. The board chair, general counsel, the head of investor relations, all of them pulled out of sleep and into the dark with him. By 6:15, 3 board members were awake and furious. And by 6:45, someone in investor relations with a fatal instinct for keeping people informed had mentioned to a contact at a financial wire that there might be a complication with the morning's expected announcement. And that contact had done the math. A major anchor investor walking away from a rescue deal hours before the markets opened, and at 7:02 had published 4 restrained paragraphs under the headline Vandermeer Faces. Jungertain Morning as key investor reportedly walks, sourced only to people familiar with the matters, which in that world is sometimes all it takes. The story did not need to shout. The facts carried the weight. $290 million, widely expected even if never formally promised, had vanished overnight. The markets opened at 9:30, and Vandermeer Collection stock dropped 4% in the first 11 minutes. By 10:15, it was down 9. By 11:15, a larger outlet had picked up the thread, and a former board member who'd resigned 18 months earlier over a governance fight gave a statement that was measured and devastating in exactly equal parts. By noon, the stock was off 19%, and the company had shed somewhere between $50 and $70 million of value. And the board had called an emergency session. Depending on emergency session, and Harrison Vandermeer was sitting at the head of a glass conference table on the 34th floor, watching people he'd known for 2 decades arrange their faces into the careful blankness of those who have already decided whose neck this is going to land on. The question that kept surfacing and sinking and surfacing again in that room, the one nobody could keep submerged, was simply, why? The deal had been months in the making. Every term agreed, every clause reviewed 4 times. And then, the night before signing, a withdrawal with no reason given. The general counsel cleared his throat and said there was something they all needed to see. He read Tessa Aguilar's incident report aloud, every line of it, and when he finished the room was the kind of quiet that has weight. Someone asked for the lobby footage. It took half an hour to pull and load onto the screen at the end of the table, and then a dozen of the most powerful people in the company sat in silence and watched the woman in the gray hoodie cross the marble, and watched the manager's 2 fingers lift, and watched the guard cross the floor, and watched the moment. Quick, ugly, undeniable, when his hands hit her shoulders and her body knocked against the pillar, and her things scattered across the floor, and watched her crouch and pick up a small framed photograph and put it back in her bag, face up, before she stood. The footage had no sound. It didn't need any. Harrison Vandermeer said 3 words into the silence that followed. They were not eloquent, but they were accurate. What did we do? It wasn't a question. There was no question mark anywhere in it. Vanessa Pruitt was summoned to the corporate offices by a message on her personal phone at 9:15 that morning, because her work account had been remotely locked at 9 sharp. She came in her full uniform out of instinct, the way certain people reach for the costume as armor when the ground starts moving. The guard at corporate reception asked for her badge quietly, without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd made a show of it. She was walked to a small windowless room on the 2nd floor, where 2 people from Human Resources and 1 from Legal sat waiting, their expressions professionally neutral and thoroughly final. There was a pitcher of water on the table. No one offered to pour it, and in those first few minutes she still believed, with the deep, unexamined confidence of a woman who had never once been seriously wrong about her own importance, that this was a misunderstanding, that a difficult guest had filed an unfair complaint, that 11 years of service would speak louder than one night, that the proper review would clear her. She said as much. She said the woman had been disruptive. She said she'd kept order. She said whatever had been reported was being blown out of proportion. The HR representative said nothing. The lawyer opened a folder, slid a single printed still from the lobby footage across the table, and set it down so it faced her. It showed the moment the guard's hands landed. It showed the photograph in midair, falling. Vanessa looked at it, and something happened to her face. The first crack in 11 years of certainty, and even then, in that first flicker, what crossed it was not remorse. It was the pale astonishment of a person realizing, for the first time in her life, that the world had never actually been arranged for her benefit, that it had only seemed that way because, until now, she'd only ever pushed on people who couldn't push back. Outside the building, the story was already everywhere. The footage had gotten out. A still, then the clip itself, sourced from somewhere nobody bothered to nail down. And by midday, it had reached the places these things reach when a story has all the right pieces in all the right proportions. The public reaction was instant and total, the specific righteous fury that erupts when something long suspected becomes suddenly, undeniably visible on a screen. People who had never set foot in a Vandermeer hotel, who had no stake in hospitality at all, found themselves shaking with anger at a 30-second clip of a woman picking her mother's photograph up off a marble floor. The hashtags formed and spread. Advocacy groups put out statements. 2 corporate partners announced they were reviewing the relationship, which is the language companies use while they figure out how fast they can leave. A consumer organization published an open letter pointing out that this was not, in fact, the first such complaint against Vandermeer properties, that there had been 3 earlier incidents over 4 years, each one quietly settled, each one buried. None of them ever acknowledged, and those old incidents, suddenly lit up by the glare of this one, turned the story from a bad night into a pattern. Every statement the company put out was measured against them and found hollow. By 2 in the afternoon, a second partner had paused its agreement pending an inquiry, which is the slow way of saying goodbye, and the company went quiet. And quiet in a crisis reads as guilt, whether it is or not. Naomi Sutton gave no interviews that day. As far as the public could tell, she was simply unreachable. Her communications advisor, a calm veteran named Paulette, who understood the strategic value of the right silence better than almost anyone, confirmed only that Miss Sutton was aware of developments and would speak when the time was right. The right time, Paulette had decided in consultation with Adrian Voss, was 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Once the news cycle had organized itself fully around the documented facts and the public's own conclusions, so that when Naomi's voice finally arrived, it would land not on ground she had to shape, but on ground already shaped in her favor. She appeared on a financial program broadcast from a studio downtown, seated in a gray chair in a dark blazer, her natural hair lit so that she looked exactly like what she was: composed, accomplished, unhurried. The anchor, a sharp interviewer who had sat across from senators and founders for 2 decades, said afterward that Naomi Sutton was among the most controlled people she had ever had in that chair. She did not weep. She did not perform her outrage. When the anchor asked her to describe what had happened, she described it the way a person gives sworn testimony, plainly without reaching for sympathy. And when the anchor asked how it had felt, Naomi was quiet for a moment, and then she said a thing that would be clipped and replayed hundreds of thousands of times in the days that followed. "The shove isn't the story," she said. "The shove is just what made the story visible. The story is that a room full of people looked at me and decided, in about 3 seconds, exactly how much I was worth and exactly how much respect I had to earn before they'd give me any. That's not a Vandermeer problem. That happens to people who look like me every single day, in lobbies and waiting rooms and job interviews, to people who will never be able to pull $290 million off a table to make it stop. I just happen to be one of the very few who can. So I'm going to." The anchor asked whether she would reconsider, whether there was any path back to the deal. Naomi said no. She'd withdrawn, and she would not be returning, and she'd already decided where the money was going instead: a smaller, regional hospitality group called Sarkspur, run by a woman named Inez Calloway, that had approached her the year before with what Naomi described as a genuine ground-up commitment to treating every guest like a human being before they'd proven a single thing about their bank account. She named it. Larkspur's tiny, barely covered stock jumped more than 30% in after-hours trading. And then she said the part that the people in the comments would hold on to longest. The part that answered a question they hadn't quite known how to ask. She said that the prior incidents mattered more than her own. "What happened to me got a camera and a headline because of who I turned out to be," she said. "But there were 3 women before me, ordinary women, who got handled the same way and got nothing. No apology, no headline, no $290 million. They're the ones this is really about. I'm just the one the company couldn't afford to ignore." The interview ended. The clip moved through every corner of the conversation. And what followed for the Vandermeer collection was not one event, but an unraveling. The chief executive resigning with a letter about wanting more time with his family, which is the language of men who were not given a choice. An external audit of company culture, commissioned less out of conscience than out of liability, which sometimes produces the same actions anyway. The guard and the manager both suspended. Institutional investors filing the kind of polite, terrifying request that means explain to us why we shouldn't sell, 2 of whom sold regardless. The company shrank. It found replacement financing at punishing terms. It would spend years smaller and quieter than it had been the morning before that woman walked into its lobby out of the rain. Vanessa Pruitt stopped going out by the end of that week, not because anyone told her to, but because her face had become recognizable in a way it had never been and would not stop being for a long time. She had not seen any of it coming, because all of it had depended on a single premise she had never once seriously entertained: that the woman in the hoodie might not be beneath her. She'd believed she was right on the floor of that lobby, and she'd believed it in the HR room, and she believed it in a thinner and thinner way through the first 48 hours. And then, sitting alone in her apartment watching the interview on her phone, she felt the belief that had functioned for 11 years as the floor under her whole life simply drop away. And what was left underneath it wasn't anything she could name yet. She sent a message through a lawyer to Adrian Voss's office, asking to meet with Naomi Sutton. She expected no answer. 3 days later, one came. Yes, 1 hour. Time and place to follow. She arrived at Naomi's offices exactly on time, in no uniform, carrying nothing, having rehearsed and discarded a dozen versions of what she wanted to say. An assistant led her to a small room where Naomi was already seated, a cup of coffee in front of her, her phone face down, her attention so completely present that Vanessa found it harder to bear than coldness would have been. Vanessa sat. She looked at her hands. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known who Naomi was. And she said it the way where she'd rehearsed it, as though that were the thing that mitigated it. And she watched the words land in exactly the wrong place and felt the whole apology collapse beneath her. Naomi set down the coffee. She looked at Vanessa for a moment, the way you look at something you've spent a long time turning over and are finally seeing clearly. That's it, she said. That's the whole thing. Right there. You didn't know who I was. You think that's your defense. You think that helps you. She let it sit. You think respect is something a person has to qualify for, that it depends on what they can prove about themselves before you decide whether they get any. I grew up getting that exact look from teachers and landlords and loan officers and interviewers every year of my life. Not because of anything I'd done, but because of what I looked like and what they decided that meant. And the difference between me and the three women before me isn't that I deserved it more. It's that I could make it cost you something. That's the only difference. And it shouldn't take that. Vanessa was crying by then, quietly, without performance, because she no longer had the composure left to perform anything. Can you forgive me? She asked, and the words came out broken in the middle. Naomi was quiet a long time. I don't know, she said finally. That's the honest answer. I don't know yet. What I know is that what you do next matters a lot more than what I decide. Then she stood, and the meeting was over, and Vanessa sat alone in the chair for a while, after she'd gone, the way you sit when movement hasn't reassembled itself into a possibility, and then she rode the elevator down and walked out into an ordinary afternoon in a city that neither knew nor cared that she was there, and for the first time in her life, that anonymity felt less like a comfort and more like a sentence. Tessa Aguilar got a phone call 4 weeks after the night in the lobby, from a number she didn't recognize and almost let go to voicemail. The warm, direct voice on the other end belonged to Greta, who explained without ceremony that Miss Sutton's new partnership with Larkspur had an opening for a director of guests, and that Miss Sutton had asked for Tessa by name. The interview happened a week later and lasted 40 minutes. Near the end, Naomi asked her why she'd sent that email at 12:40 in the morning when she'd been told, directly, to let it go. Tessa thought about it, and then she said that she'd known what she'd seen was wrong, and she'd known that if she went home and slept on it and did nothing, she'd wake up the next day as someone she didn't want to be. Naomi nodded slowly and asked nothing further on that subject. The offer came the next day. Tessa accepted it in under an hour. The world moved on the way it does, not cleanly, not in some satisfying snap of resolution, but forward. Larkspur grew. Naomi wrote her conditions into the company's bones rather than its brochures. Ongoing training in dignified service, complaint channels that bypassed direct managers, quarterly outside audits of how guests were actually treated, senior bonuses tied to anonymous dignity scores rather than occupancy rates. All its scholarship fund she'd endowed years earlier doubled its support for first-generation engineering students. And one afternoon, she stood at a small podium in the neighborhood where she'd grown up, 2 blocks from the laundry where her mother had folded other people's shirts for 26 years. And she told a room of teenagers something she'd believed for a long time and never quite said out loud. She said that real power, not the kind borrowed from a uniform or a name tag or a set of assumptions about who belongs where, but the kind that stays when everything else is stripped off, comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when an entire room is working to make you doubt it. She said, it takes most of a life to learn that, and it's worth every year. She said, the quietest person in the room is very often the one paying the closest attention, and the one paying closest attention is very often the one who, when the moment finally comes, knows exactly what to do. Then she stepped back from the podium, and the room rose to its feet, and outside the afternoon light moved across the face of a city that held, as cities do, all its versions at once, its cruelties and its recoveries, its Vanessas and its Tessas, and its 3 forgotten women and its Naomis. all of them somewhere out there in it, going about the slow, unfinished, necessary work of learning, at last, to actually look at one another.